The night was buzzing with energy as the studio lights illuminated the set of The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon. The audience was filled with excitement, their eager faces lit up with anticipation. The show was about to begin, and the guest of honor for the evening was none other than Keanu Reeves. Jimmy Fallon, as usual, was full of energy, ready to bring his signature humor to the stage. The warm-up music played and the audience clapped along, their voices building with enthusiasm. It was the kind of night where everything seemed to be set up for the usual high-energy chaos. Fallon was known for his quick wit, playful antics, and fast-paced conversations with his celebrity guests. Yet there was something different in the air tonight. Keanu Reeves was no ordinary guest. In fact, Keanu wasn't your typical Hollywood superstar. He had a way of making you feel like you were sitting down with an old friend. His easygoing nature, his humble demeanor, and the way he carried himself always left people feeling like they had just spent time with someone who truly understood life. As the cameras rolled and the theme song played, the audience's clapping grew louder. The host, Jimmy Fallon, stood up and waved to the crowd. His smile was wide and his excitement was palpable, but underneath it all, you could sense a layer of respect and admiration for Keanu. The two had known each other for a while, and Jimmy, despite his usual playful demeanor, always seemed to approach Keanu with a level of reverence. Tonight, folks, we have a very special guest, one of the most iconic actors of our time. A man who has captured hearts with his performances, his generosity, and his timeless coolness. Please welcome the one and only Keanu Reeves, Jimmy announced, his voice echoing through the studio. The moment Keanu stepped out, the applause was deafening. He was dressed simply in his signature casual style, black jeans, a dark t-shirt, and a leather jacket. His hair was tousled, his face looking both youthful and wise, as if he had lived several lives in one. His smile was kind, warm but reserved, the kind that made you feel like you had just encountered a rare and precious moment. Keanu walked to the center of the stage, shaking hands with Jimmy. The two exchanged a brief hug, and then Keanu took his seat on the couch next to Jimmy. The audience was still clapping, and for a moment it felt as though time had slowed down. It was as though everyone in that room could feel how significant this moment was, even if they couldn't put it into words. The conversation began like any other. Jimmy opened with the usual banter, asking Keanu about his latest projects and how he had been keeping busy. Keanu's responses were gentle, his voice calm and measured, but there was something about him that made the crowd feel instantly comfortable. He wasn't the type to boast or get caught up in the glitz of fame. Instead, he spoke about his work with genuine passion, but without a sense of pretension. You could tell that Keanu had a natural humility about him, one that had become his trademark over the years. "Keanu, you've done it all," Jimmy said, a grin on his face. "From action-packed blockbusters to intense dramas, you've been in some of the most iconic movies of our generation. But I have to ask, what's it been like to see yourself become such a huge part of pop culture?" Keanu paused, thinking for a moment. It wasn't the kind of question you expected him to answer quickly, and that was part of his charm. Keanu didn't rush his thoughts. He wasn't looking for a soundbite or a clever quip. He spoke with intention, choosing his words carefully. It's been interesting," Keanu replied slowly. "I never really saw it coming, you know? I just wanted to be a part of something meaningful, something that would connect with people. The fact that my work has resonated with so many, well, that's something special." Jimmy smiled, nodding in agreement. "And that's what makes you Keanu Reeves. You have this ability to connect with people on a deeper level, and I think that's why we all love you so much." The audience chuckled in agreement, and Keanu gave a small, humble smile. It was as though the applause wasn't for his fame or his work. It was for the man he was, the way he carried himself and the way he made others feel. As the interview continued, Jimmy lightened the mood by asking Keanu about some of his more light-hearted experiences on set. He told stories of pranks, jokes, and behind-the-scenes moments from The Matrix, John Wick, and other films. Keanu, ever the good sport, laughed along, sharing anecdotes that had the audience in stitches. But even amidst the laughter, there was a sense that Keanu was holding something back. It wasn't that he was being secretive or evasive. It was more like he was being careful with what he shared, as if the surface-level conversation was just a warm-up. There was a quiet depth to him that seemed to be waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And then, As if on cue, Jimmy asked a question that would change the course of the interview. You know, Keanu, you've been in the public eye for so long, and you've seen so much. I've always wondered, what is it that really matters to you? What's the most important thing in life for you? It was a simple question, one that seemed to come from a place of genuine curiosity. But as soon as it left Jimmy's mouth, the mood in the studio shifted. The audience quieted slightly, sensing that this was no ordinary question. Keanu didn't respond right away. Instead, he sat back in his chair, his eyes focused on the ground for a brief moment, almost as though he were gathering his thoughts. Jimmy, realizing the weight of the question, sat back as well, allowing Keanu the space to think. For a moment, there was complete silence in the studio. Even the audience, usually quick to react to every word spoken, seemed to hold their breath in anticipation. It was as though everyone knew that Keanu was about to share something far more meaningful than anyone could have anticipated. The room fell into a heavy silence as Keanu took a deep breath. The audience could feel the weight of the moment, the kind of pause that signaled something was about to be said that would resonate far beyond the usual light-hearted chatter of a talk show. Jimmy, ever the quick thinker, wasn't about to interrupt. He knew, just like everyone else in the room, that Keanu was about to say something far more profound than anyone could have imagined. For a few seconds, Keanu just sat there, his eyes cast downward. It wasn't awkward, though. It wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like Keanu was simply thinking, gathering his thoughts, sorting through a sea of emotions, or perhaps deciding how best to share what he was feeling. He wasn't in a rush to speak, which was one of the things that made him so different from the usual celebrity. Most stars would have jumped in with a clever line, a joke, or a polished response. But not Keanu. He wasn't performing for the cameras. He wasn't concerned with how people saw him. He was just being. And then, when he finally spoke, it was as if he'd opened a door into something real. "What matters to me," Keanu began slowly, his voice low and steady, "is really simple, but it's not something that everyone understands right away." He paused, looking up at Jimmy now, his eyes meeting the host's with a directness that made Jimmy feel like the only person in the room. "I think," Keanu continued, his voice gaining a bit of strength, "what matters most to me is kindness. You know, just being kind, to people, to animals, to the earth. It's really simple, but it's also really hard for a lot of people to understand. We're all so busy, so caught up in the rush of life that we forget how much a small act of kindness can change the world around us." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, no one spoke. Even the audience, who had been eagerly waiting for the next funny quip or interesting story, were quiet, reflecting on what Keanu had just said. It wasn't just another celebrity answer. This wasn't a rehearsed line. This was raw and real. Jimmy blinked, clearly taken aback by the depth of Keanu's response. He opened his mouth to say something, but paused, unsure of how to follow up. It wasn't that he didn't have anything to say. It was that Keanu had just shared something that felt too big, too important for a quick follow-up. Keanu looked around the room as if taking in the reaction of the audience. He didn't seem to be searching for approval, but rather, he seemed to want people to understand the simplicity of what he was saying. His gaze softened, and for a moment you could see the weight of his words settling in. "You know," he went on, his voice barely above a whisper now, "I think we all get so caught up in thinking we need to do something huge to make a difference. We think that it has to be something grand, something that everyone will notice, but it doesn't. It's the small moments, the small things we do for each other that can really change the world." The room was completely still. Jimmy Fallon, known for his quick comebacks and ability to keep the energy of the show going, was at a loss for words. He wasn't looking for a punchline or a clever follow-up. He was simply processing what Keanu had just shared. Keanu's words seemed to carry a weight that no one had expected. This wasn't the typical celebrity fluff, the rehearsed lines about how happy they were to be on the show, or how excited they were for their latest project. This was something deeper, something that resonated with people on a personal level, and as Keanu continued, it became clear that this wasn't just a moment of reflection for him. This was a message he had been carrying with him for a long time. "I try to live my life in a way that is authentic to who I am. And sometimes that means stepping back, looking at things from a different perspective, and realizing that all the noise, all the fame, and all the success don't really matter if you're not being true to yourself. If you're not kind. If you're not contributing positively to the world." There was a sincerity in his voice, something you didn't often hear from someone so famous. Keanu wasn't trying to be profound for the sake of it. He wasn't trying to lecture anyone. He was simply sharing his truth. And in that moment, it felt like the world had paused just to listen. Jimmy sat back in his chair, his usual playfulness gone. He was no longer just a host talking to a guest. He was a person having a conversation with someone who had clearly thought deeply about life and the way we interact with one another. Jimmy's eyes were wide, his usual quick wit and energy replaced by something softer, something more reflective. I don't know what to say to that, man. Jimmy finally responded, his voice quiet but filled with admiration. That's beautiful. Honestly, I think people need to hear that. More than ever. Keanu gave a small nod as if acknowledging the sentiment, but he wasn't looking for validation. His gaze shifted back to the audience, his eyes moving slowly from one face to the next. It was clear he wasn't just talking to Jimmy. He was speaking to everyone in that room, everyone watching at home. There was something almost meditative in the way he spoke, like he wasn't just giving an interview but offering a piece of his soul. You know, Keanu added, after a beat, it's not about making huge changes overnight. It's about how you treat the person next to you. It's about how you treat the person who serves you your coffee, the person who holds the door for you, or even the person who's struggling to make it through the day. It's those little moments that matter. The words were simple, yet they were profound. The audience, who had been on the edge of their seats, was now completely silent. Everyone was listening. Everyone was hanging on to every word, realizing that what Keanu was saying wasn't just something he believed. It was something he lived. Jimmy, who was known for his energy and humor, now sat in thoughtful silence. He didn't rush to speak. He didn't try to crack a joke or make light of the situation. He simply let Keanu's words wash over him, processing the gravity of the conversation that was unfolding before him. For a brief moment, the usual buzz of the show seemed to fade away. The set, the lights, the cameras, all of it felt distant. What mattered in that moment was the connection between Keanu and the audience, a connection that was built on honesty, vulnerability, and the simple truth of being kind to one another. Keanu looked back at Jimmy, giving him a small smile, but there was something different in his expression now. It was as if he had shared a piece of himself that he didn't often reveal to the public. And somehow in that moment, everyone in the room, everyone watching at home, felt like they had just experienced something rare. I think if we all just tried a little harder to be kind to each other, Keanu said, his voice quiet but steady, the world would be a much better place. It's as simple as that. The words hung in the air, and for a few more seconds there was nothing but silence. It was the kind of silence that felt full of meaning, full of understanding, and full of the kind of connection that doesn't need to be said, but only felt. And for the first time that night, Jimmy Fallon didn't feel the need to rush in with a joke or a witty comment. He just let the moment sit. He let the words linger, understanding that what Keanu had shared was more important than anything he could say to follow it. The audience, too, sat in silence, absorbing what they had just heard. It was as though everyone in that room knew they had just been part of something much bigger than a late-night talk show. This was a moment that would stay with them long after the cameras stopped rolling. Keanu had just opened a door to a more meaningful conversation, and now it was up to everyone else to walk through it. For a few seconds, the room remained silent. It was a silence that felt strange but peaceful. The audience, usually so quick to react with claps and cheers, was left to absorb the weight of what Keanu had just shared. His words had a ripple effect, and no one seemed ready to break the moment. Jimmy, sitting beside him, seemed almost in awe, struggling to process what he had just heard. Keanu was never one to boast or exaggerate. He wasn't someone who sought to make himself the center of attention. It was part of what made him so special. His humility, his ability to remain grounded despite the massive success and fame that had come his way. But tonight, in this moment, something about him had felt different. His vulnerability was palpable, and it had struck a chord with everyone in that room. It wasn't just about kindness, though. That was a part of it, yes. But the deeper message Keanu had shared was that life was more than what we often think it is. It was more than the accolades and the constant hustle for recognition. It was about the connections we make, the small, quiet moments that often go unnoticed. Keanu had a way of making people realize that they didn't have to do something monumental to make a difference in the world. Sometimes all it took was being present, being kind, and treating others with respect. Jimmy, still in a bit of shock from Keanu's words, cleared his throat and finally broke the silence. His voice, softer than usual, carried a tone of sincerity that was rare for him. "You know, Keanu," he began, "I think that's something a lot of people need to hear right now. I mean, we get so caught up in everything around us, the work, the fame, the pressures, and forget that the small things matter too. You've just kind of redefined what it means to make a difference." Keanu smiled, but it was a quiet, humble smile. He wasn't looking for praise. In fact, it seemed like he was almost surprised by the way his words had landed. He had never intended to give a speech, never intended to spark such a deep conversation. But here they were, and it felt like the energy of the entire room had shifted. "I think we all need reminders sometimes," Keanu said, his voice soft but steady. "We all get lost in the noise, and it's easy to forget that kindness doesn't have to be loud. It doesn't have to be a big gesture. It can be something as simple as holding the door open for someone or just listening when someone needs to talk." Jimmy nodded, his usual playful tone replaced with something more serious. "That's the truth, man," he said, his words more thoughtful than they had been all night. "And you know, sometimes I think we're all so focused on what's next that we forget to just be present. We forget to appreciate the people around us, the moments that matter." Keanu didn't respond right away. Instead, he glanced out toward the audience, and for a moment it seemed like he was reflecting on the lives of the people sitting in front of him. The lights of the studio, which usually felt so artificial and bright, now seemed to fade into the background. It was as if the space itself had been infused with something deeper, something more real. The audience, who had been anxiously awaiting their turn to react, seemed to hold their breath. It wasn't just that they had been moved by Keanu's words. It was that they were all experiencing something unspoken. They understood that this wasn't a typical late-night interview. This wasn't the usual fluff and jokes. It felt like something more, a rare moment of genuine human connection. Keanu turned back to Jimmy, his expression thoughtful. "I think part of the reason people forget to be kind," he said, "is because they're always looking for something more. More success, more fame, more recognition. But the truth is that stuff doesn't bring real happiness. It might bring temporary satisfaction, but it doesn't fill the soul." Jimmy, who had been nodding along, leaned forward slightly, his curiosity piqued. "So Keanu, how do you stay grounded in all of that? I mean, you're Keanu Reeves. People literally adore you. How do you keep it all in perspective?" Keanu paused, his eyes meeting Jimmy's. The question was genuine, but it was also an invitation for Keanu to share a bit more of his story. Keanu's response, however, wasn't what Jimmy had expected. "I think it's about remembering where I came from," Keanu said quietly. "I've seen a lot of ups and downs in my life, and I've learned that nothing is permanent. Not the highs and not the lows. I've lost people I loved, I've faced struggles, and I've seen how fragile life can be. And in the end, what matters isn't the fame or the wealth. It's the people you've shared your life with, the kindness you've given and the love you've received." There was a somber quality to Keanu's voice now, a depth that no one in the room could ignore. The atmosphere had shifted again, this time in a way that felt almost sacred. The audience was listening not just to Keanu the actor, but to Keanu the person, someone who had lived through hardship and understood the true meaning of life in a way that many never would. Jimmy sat back in his chair, taking in what Keanu had just shared. He didn't rush to fill the space with humor. He didn't need to. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with the weight of the conversation. Keanu's words had left an imprint on the night, something that no scripted joke or prepared line could ever replicate. And for the first time in a long while, Jimmy found himself struggling to find the right words to say. "What you're saying is so important, man," Jimmy finally said, his voice filled with respect. "And I think we all need to hear it. It's easy to get wrapped up in our own lives, to think that the world revolves around us. But you're right. It's the little things, the everyday acts of kindness that make the biggest difference." Keanu nodded. "Exactly. It's about being aware of the world around you, not just living in your own bubble. We're all connected in some way, and the way we treat others is what defines us." Jimmy leaned in, his curiosity still piqued. "Do you think people are starting to realize that? Or do you think we're still too focused on the wrong things? Keanu gave a small smile, but it wasn't a smile of amusement. It was more like a smile of understanding, a recognition that sometimes the world wasn't ready for the truth until it had been shaken up a bit. I think people are waking up, he said quietly. I think more and more people are realizing that kindness is something we can all practice. It doesn't take much, but it changes everything. The conversation had taken a deep turn, and it was clear that no one in the room, least of all Jimmy, had been expecting this. What was supposed to be a light-hearted chat about Keanu's career had evolved into a profound discussion about life, love, and the things that truly matter. The show, which had once felt like just another late-night interview, had transformed into something far more meaningful, and as the cameras continued to roll, capturing every word, every glance, and every small shift in the atmosphere, it was clear that the audience was experiencing something special, something that would stay with them long after the show was over. Keanu, still as calm and composed as ever, had once again proven that he was more than just an actor. He was someone who understood the world on a deeper level, someone who had the rare ability to speak truth in a way that resonated with everyone around him. Jimmy, now more reflective than usual, couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude. He was sitting next to someone who had the power to change the way people saw the world, not through flashy performances or grand gestures, but through simple, honest words. As the conversation continued, it was clear that this night, this moment, was something neither of them would ever forget. The atmosphere in the studio felt different now. It was still buzzing with energy, but the energy had shifted. The usual excitement of a talk show, quick jokes, light-hearted moments, and playful banter was no longer at the forefront. Instead, there was a deeper, quieter energy. It was the kind of atmosphere you only get when something real, something meaningful has been shared. The cameras were still rolling, capturing every subtle moment, but it wasn't just about what was happening on screen. For those in the audience, the conversation with Keanu had become something more than just entertainment. It was an unexpected moment of connection, a reminder of the small but important things in life. The audience was captivated, not by Keanu's usual charm or his roles in action-packed films, but by his words, his honesty. It felt like everyone in that room had been given permission to pause, take a breath, and consider their own lives a little more deeply. For Jimmy, the shift was just as noticeable. He had started the evening in his usual high-energy, upbeat style, but now, as he sat beside Keanu, his usual playful wit had faded into the background. He wasn't trying to steer the conversation back to jokes or easy laughs. Instead, he was fully present, listening and reflecting on what Keanu had shared. It was rare for Jimmy to show such quiet sincerity on his show, and yet, here he was, sitting next to a man who seemed to understand life in a way that was far beyond the celebrity interviews he'd done countless times. I gotta say, Keanu? Jimmy finally broke the silence, his voice softer than usual. What you've been saying tonight has really hit home. I mean, I think a lot of people watching might be sitting there thinking, I've been chasing the wrong things. We all get caught up in the next big thing, the next big paycheck, or the next big project. But what you're talking about, just being present, being kind, that's something we can all do. Right now. Keanu looked over at him, his expression calm, almost like he was giving Jimmy the space to process everything he had said. There wasn't any rush. No need to fill the quiet with more words. Keanu understood the power of silence too. That's exactly it, Keanu responded, his voice still quiet but filled with certainty. The world doesn't need us to be perfect. It just needs us to be real. And sometimes that means being honest about what's important. Kindness doesn't take much. It doesn't cost a thing, but it changes everything. And if we can all start doing that, it would make a bigger impact than any of us could imagine. Jimmy leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful look crossing his face. He wasn't just listening to Keanu now. He was processing the bigger picture, realizing how much of what Keanu was saying applied to his own life. The fame, the late-night gigs, the hustle, it all suddenly felt less important than it ever had before. He glanced at Keanu, who had a relaxed yet earnest demeanor, as if he had been having this conversation with himself for years, long before tonight. You know, you're not the first person to say something like this, Jimmy said, his voice almost pensive. But the way you say it, it just hits differently. It feels real. And it's funny, because when you're in this world of constant movement and change, you forget that. You forget that all the chasing doesn't actually get you anywhere. Keanu nodded, understanding the weight behind Jimmy's words. We all get caught up in it, he said. It's easy to do, but there comes a point when you have to step back and ask yourself, what really matters? It's a question I've had to ask myself more times than I can count. The audience, who had been hanging on every word, seemed to be processing their own reflections too. You could almost feel the collective understanding in the air. Keanu wasn't just speaking to Jimmy. He was speaking to everyone in that room and even to those watching at home. His words were universal, timeless even. The more he spoke, the more the audience understood that what Keanu was sharing wasn't just for them as fans, but for them as people. Jimmy's next question broke the stillness that had fallen over the room, but it was a question that seemed to come from a genuine place of curiosity. So, Keanu, Jimmy began, his tone thoughtful, do you ever get frustrated by the way the world works? I mean, you're someone who clearly values kindness and authenticity, but in this industry it must be hard to keep that up, right? With all the pressure and the expectations, how do you stay true to yourself? Keanu took a moment to think. His eyes flickered for a second, and you could tell that this question wasn't as simple as it seemed. It was the kind of question that required deep reflection, one that wasn't about responding quickly, but about choosing the right words. I won't lie, Keanu said finally. There have been times when I've been frustrated with the way things go, with the way people treat each other, with the way the world often prioritizes the wrong things. But then I remember that frustration doesn't change anything. It's easy to be frustrated and angry, but real change, real peace comes from being true to yourself in the face of all of that. Jimmy looked at Keanu, clearly impressed by the calm wisdom in his voice. So you just keep going? Even when things get tough? Keanu smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling with warmth. You just keep going. You do the best you can and you focus on what matters. What I've learned is that the tough times are often the moments that teach you the most. You don't grow by staying comfortable. You grow when you challenge yourself, when you make mistakes, and when you learn from them. The crowd seemed to resonate with Keanu's words. There was a palpable shift, as if everyone was internalizing the simplicity yet depth of what he had just said. It wasn't just about staying true to yourself in the face of fame or pressure. It was about growth, resilience, and finding peace even when life got messy. Jimmy sat back, clearly moved by Keanu's words. The studio audience was in the same boat. They had come to see a talk show to hear jokes and stories. But what they were witnessing was something rare, something real. It was like they were all part of something much bigger than just a typical late-night interview. I think people need to hear this, Jimmy said quietly, more to himself than to Keanu. We're all so used to just keeping our heads down and getting through the day. But what if we stopped and took a second to really think about what we're doing? What if we realized that kindness really is the answer? Keanu looked at Jimmy and nodded again. Exactly. It's not always easy, but it's always worth it. And it doesn't just make the world better, it makes you better. For a moment, Jimmy just nodded, letting the words settle in. It wasn't often that someone as famous as Keanu spoke with such honesty and depth. But tonight, Keanu had managed to share something beyond his career, beyond the roles he'd played in movies. He had shared a piece of his soul, and it had resonated with everyone in that room. It wasn't just the audience in the studio who was listening. The entire conversation was being broadcast, reaching millions of people at home. And somewhere, across the world, someone was hearing these words at the right moment. Someone who needed to hear that kindness mattered, that it was okay to stop chasing after everything and just be present in the now. Keanu didn't speak to entertain. He didn't speak to impress. He spoke to remind people that they were all connected, that their actions, small and big, mattered. That life, with all its challenges and moments of struggle, still had the potential to be beautiful, if only people allowed themselves to be kind. And as the show continued, the energy in the room remained different. It wasn't the kind of high-energy, fast-paced banter that typically marked late-night shows. It was a slower, more deliberate pace, a pace that allowed everyone to reflect, to think, to process. And in that moment, it felt like everyone was a little more connected, a little more aware of the power they had to change their world, one small act of kindness at a time. Keanu had shared more than just stories about his career. He had shared his heart. And in doing so, he had left a lasting impact on everyone who had heard him. The real show was no longer about the next joke, the next question. It was about understanding life at its core and living it with kindness one moment at a time. As the conversation continued, the mood in the studio began to settle into something more profound. The high energy that usually filled the room with laughter and clapping was replaced with a quieter, more introspective atmosphere. Jimmy, who had always been the host known for quick jokes and playful banter, was now the one reflecting on Keanu's words with quiet sincerity. The audience, too, seemed to shift their focus. They were no longer just watching the show. They were living it, taking it in, and thinking about how it applied to their own lives. Keanu had a way of making people feel like they weren't just spectators. They were part of a conversation that went beyond the typical celebrity interview. He wasn't trying to impress anyone with stories from his Hollywood career, or entertaining with flashy anecdotes. Instead, Keanu had managed to get to the heart of something universal, something everyone could relate to: the power of kindness, presence, and taking life one moment at a time. It wasn't lost on Jimmy how rare this moment was. He had interviewed countless stars, but none had left such an impression on him. None had made him sit back and truly think about what mattered most. It was clear now more than ever that Keanu wasn't just a talented actor. He was a person who lived with an understanding of the world that most people only dreamed of. His words weren't just meant to inspire others. They were a reflection of the way he chose to live his life. For a few moments, the two men sat in silence. Jimmy took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the studio as if he was seeing everything in a new light. The audience, too, seemed to be taking it all in, reflecting on the things that truly mattered, things like kindness, connection, and authenticity. Finally, Jimmy spoke again, his voice quieter now but filled with a sense of understanding. "I think you've really made us all think tonight, Keanu. It's funny. We come on here, we joke around, we have a good time, and it's all great. But you've shown us something different tonight. You've shown us what it means to live with purpose, to live with heart." Keanu smiled, but it was a soft smile, one that seemed to come from a place of genuine humility. "It's not always easy," he said quietly, "but it's always worth it. Life has a way of testing you, pushing you to your limits, but it's in those moments that you learn the most about yourself." Jimmy nodded, his mind still processing everything. "I think a lot of us forget that. We get so caught up in the chase, the next big thing, the next milestone, that we forget to slow down and appreciate what we have right in front of us." Keanu leaned forward slightly, his eyes thoughtful. "Exactly. And it's not about being perfect. It's about showing up, being present, and doing your best. We all have our struggles, our moments of doubt, but it's how we handle them that defines us. It's how we treat others and ourselves in those moments that matter." The audience, who had been listening closely, seemed to hang on every word. Keanu's ability to speak with such honesty and depth had clearly struck a chord. The energy in the room had shifted completely from the typical late-night vibe to something more reflective, more connected. It felt like they weren't just watching Keanu Reeves on a talk show. They were sharing a moment of real human connection. Jimmy, still caught in the moment, leaned back in his chair. "I think this is something we all need to hear. I know I do. We all need reminders to be kinder, to be more present, and to stop chasing things that won't actually make us happy." Keanu nodded slowly, the weight of his words settling in. The world is loud. It's easy to get lost in the noise. But sometimes the best thing you can do is step back, listen, and just be there for the people who need you. There was a long pause as the two men shared a look of understanding. For a moment, it felt like the whole world had slowed down. The audience was no longer a distant group of strangers. They were all part of this shared experience, absorbing something deeper than just entertainment. They were being given a glimpse into something much more valuable, a perspective on life that could change the way they saw the world. Jimmy finally broke the silence. "You know, Keanu," he said with a small smile, "I think you just gave us all a much-needed wake-up call. I'm sure a lot of people watching tonight are going to think twice about how they treat others, and how they treat themselves." Keanu smiled in return, but this time, it was more than just a polite smile. It was a smile of understanding, a recognition that he had made a real impact. "If even just one person hears what I said tonight and it helps them in some way, then it was worth it. That's what matters." The audience, who had been hanging on every word, erupted into applause. It wasn't the usual kind of applause. It wasn't the loud, excited clapping that came after a funny moment or a surprise twist. This applause was softer, more deliberate. It was the kind of applause that came from a place of appreciation, from a recognition that something meaningful had just been shared. As the applause slowly faded, Jimmy turned to the camera, addressing the audience at home. "You know, I don't think we've ever had a moment like this on the show before. Keanu, you've really opened our eyes tonight, and I think everyone who's watching can agree. You've made us all think about life a little differently." Keanu looked at the camera for a moment, his expression sincere. "I hope everyone out there knows that they're not alone. We all go through struggles, we all face challenges, but we're all in this together. And if we can just be kind to each other, to ourselves, we can make a real difference." The audience, still feeling the weight of the conversation, began to clap again. This time, the applause felt like a collective acknowledgement, not just of Keanu's words, but of the power of kindness and connection that had been brought to the forefront of the conversation. As the camera zoomed out and the credits began to roll, the crew behind the scenes exchanged glances. Everyone in that room knew something special had just happened. It wasn't just another late-night interview. It had been a conversation that transcended the usual banter and jokes. It had been a conversation that touched on what it meant to be human. In the moments after the show ended, as the audience slowly filed out of the studio, you could sense that something had shifted. There were no loud conversations, no rushed exits. People were leaving the studio with their heads a little higher, their hearts a little fuller. They had come to see a talk show, but what they had walked away with was something far more important. Jimmy, standing off to the side, watched as the crew packed up, a thoughtful expression on his face. It was rare for him to feel moved by an interview. He had interviewed hundreds of celebrities over the years, but tonight had been different. Tonight he had learned something. Tonight he had been reminded of what truly mattered. And Keanu, after all the cameras had turned off and the crew began to wrap up, stood quietly off to the side. He wasn't looking for attention. He wasn't looking for applause. He was simply taking in the moment, knowing that his words had made a difference not just in the world of entertainment, but in the hearts of those who had listened. As the studio lights dimmed, Keanu's simple message lingered in the air. Life, with all its ups and downs, wasn't about chasing success or fame. It was about showing kindness, being present and living with a sense of purpose. And in that moment, everyone who had been part of the show, whether in the studio or at home, had been given a reminder of just how powerful those small acts of kindness could be. It was a night that would be remembered, not for the jokes or the laughs, but for the quiet wisdom shared in a simple, unexpected moment. And for everyone who had been there to witness it, life felt just a little bit more meaningful.